And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your hopefully happy hump day here with me in New York. A very hot and steamy and more humid than yesterday, more uncomfortable. The real feel was higher today. It was like 107. Double middle fingered salute to Mother Nature. Sorry. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Now, today does mark the movie anniversary of a very famous, iconic, legendary franchise. 43 years ago today saw the release of Ridley Scott's greatest science fiction film ever made, as far as I'm concerned, Blade Runner. But I have discussed that film. Not surprisingly, a movie-centric podcast has discussed Blade Runner I don't even know how many times, so we are going to skip past that. We are not going to focus on Blade Runner today. We're going to go to another entry in our continuing series of the best movie you've never seen. And oddly enough, this one can also be cross-referenced as part of the Great Movies series. It's both. It's a movie that you're unlikely to have seen, especially if you're under 40. And it is a fantastic film from an all-time great filmmaker who, because he hasn't been that active of late, is maybe a little bit below the radar, except for hardcore cineasts. Again, if you're under, let's say, 40, you might know the name, but you're less likely to be able to talk about some of his finest films. The filmmaker in question is John Sayles. The movie is his 1996 masterpiece called Lone Star. And, we could make Spaceballs jokes, but it has nothing to do. This is not the sequel to Spaceballs, but 9 years after Spaceballs. It's called Lone Star because it takes place in the Lone Star State. And this movie was released 29 years ago Friday. So there's all kinds of possible ways to work this particular incredible film onto a movie podcast. But the most important thing is that this is the best movie that a lot of people have not seen. There have been some on this of this series, and you all know this. There's some of this series that maybe a quarter of you have seen. There aren't any that are like, oh yeah, 3/4 of people tuning in to the audio. Oh, of course I've seen this. I try to keep it at least a little bit obscure. This film is obscure only because it's 29 years old. Because if you just look at the cast, and in particular one actor, a big name, it wouldn't be below the radar if it had come out a little bit later. So Lone Star is the sort of film where you can't talk about it without getting into some level of political discussion. This is not a film that is political on the surface, but just the fact that most of the action takes place in Texas in a border town, like it's there. You can pretend that it isn't there, but it's there. John Sayles, though, he's a fascinating figure, because there have been filmmakers, and someone I recently mentioned a couple of days ago in Steven Soderbergh, there have been people who cut their teeth making kind of groundbreaking, galvanizing independent films, such as Steven Soderbergh, and then ended up having huge careers within the studio system. It's not really called that, but I just refer to it as when I say the studio system, I just mean working for the Hollywood machinery one way or another. In the case of Soderbergh, he's still been able to make distinctive films under the studio banner and for the studio's money, and that's really difficult to do. John Sayles is somebody who almost literally has had the opposite career of Steven Soderbergh, and it's also a little bit ironic that the actor I keep referencing, who I haven't named yet, there is a joke with him and Soderbergh that I'll get to. Matt Damon told a joke about this guy and Soderbergh. But so Steven Soderbergh started as an independent filmmaker and then moved to the studio system while still making independent films here and there, but he also did big studio pieces such as Erin Brockovich and obviously the Ocean's movie with the aforementioned George Clooney, Out of Sight with George Clooney. John Sayles was somebody who, as a very young man, was thought to be just a genius writer, a real strong writer with great ideas and ability to adapt different kinds of material. And he started his career working in Hollywood, even if he wasn't literally living there. Films like Return of the Secaucus 7, Brother from Another Planet, he was working within some form of what I refer to as the studio system. I keep laughing because when I say studio system, I usually mean like 1940s and 50s. You know, the days of David O. Selznick and people like that. You know, Louis B. Mayer, David O. Selznick, that's when I think of the studio system. But John Sayles was meant for more. He was meant for different. And he was asked, after he achieved success in the 80s, he made films such as Matewan, a really incredible movie with James Earl Jones, among others, about a coal miner strike. Just a very vibrant, almost visionary type of a movie. It doesn't feel like an independent film. John Sayles was asked, once he kind of began to make it, doing his own thing, you could have had a huge career if you had stayed doing what you were doing. Why did you want to go the independent route? You'd think there would have been a lot more money doing the other way, whatever it was said. And he's been asked this on more than one occasion, but it's this one particular interview. I don't think it was Roger Ebert. It could have been him, though, because Ebert interviewed John Sayles on a number of occasions for, other films, including Matewan. When John Sayles was asked why he went the independent route, wasn't trying to be funny. His answer was incredible and perfect. He said, I got tired of those motherfuckers and their fucking notes. And what he meant, and I'm sure there are a lot of writer-directors and there are a lot of people who worked on the outer edges of the movie business, such as myself as a writer, where you just get tired of people who often don't know, in the immortal words of Jim Belushi, they don't know shit from fuck, and they're telling you what's wrong with your script. And oftentimes you get the feeling they didn't even read it. Maybe they glanced through it and just decided to write some notes. In the case of Sayles, he took this very seriously, and he took it to heart. And this is something that David Mamet has also talked. Again, you're talking about people at the top end of the business, and they still don't like when their work is judged by people they don't feel have any standing to tell them what's wrong with their work. So John Sayles set off on his own. He was convinced that with the right collaborators and people who knew what they were reading, and that he trusted, if he said, are you really going to read this, or are you just going to skim over it and give me 2 pages of notes as if I have to do them? He had people, he had a core group around him who he trusted. And he was able to make kind of landmark films such as Matewan, and what I think is his second best film, 8 Men Out. The really fantastic, almost a docudrama about the 1919, the ill-fated Chicago White Sox, or the Black Sox. And that's if you've seen Field of Dreams or are familiar with it, it's the true story of that. It's the real story of what happened with Shoeless Joe Jackson and all the people who, through the 1919 World Series, they were paid by gamblers, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. They were screwed over repeatedly by their owner, who at the time was one of the richest men in the whole fucking world, Charles Comiskey. What a fucking bum. What a piece of crap that guy was. He created the environment that made it possible for his team to punt that World Series. So John Sayles had made a number of distinctive, different, iconic in their own way films, and he was a critical darling. That's a bit of a cliche, and sometimes that's an element that a person will want to run from, but John Sayles did not run from it. He just continued to make these really original, unusual movies where film critics such as Roger Ebert, Gene Siskel, and David Denby, writing for New York Magazine at the time, they always pointed out it's very difficult to even contemplate, how did John Sayles, why did he arrive on this story? How could he even have thought of this in the first place? It's just the magic of that guy, and what a kind of different thinker he was and has been. As I say, hasn't really worked that much of late. He's done some TV. He's getting up there. He's in his 70s now. But the movie Lone Star, many people think is his best film. I will put it just behind 8 Men Out. I have 8 Men Out as a 10 out of 10. I think it's the best film. It's one of the best films of the decade of the 80s. It's that good. Lone Star is a 9.5 out of 10. It is an incredible film that gets into a lot of different areas that you've seen before, but you haven't seen it done like this. So the story opens in what is present day at the time. It would be, the movie was shot in 1995, but it's supposed to be near the Texas-Mexico border. Sometime in, let's just call it the present, sometime in 1996. And an actor who ended up winning an Oscar, a terrific actor, he made a lot of movies with, not surprisingly, John Sayles, Chris Cooper. Chris Cooper is the central character in the film. He plays a sheriff named Sam, or Samuel, but I think he just goes by Sam Deeds. And he's the sheriff of this town, and he's likable enough, and he's respected enough. But he's living in the shadow of his father, Buddy, who was the greatest sheriff that this border town has ever had. The father, Buddy Deeds, who we see in flashbacks, is played by a very young and rising fast Matthew McConaughey. And that's the actor that I kept referencing without naming. Matthew McConaughey only appears in the flashback sequences. And this is a very unusual way to tell this particular story, because they're flashbacks that don't feel like normal flashbacks. And this is not a Pulp Fiction structure. This is a narrative that jumps back and forth and weaves its way through time, but it does it in such clever, inventive ways that it's never grating, and you're never like, okay, when are we going to get back to McConaughey or anything like that? So Chris Christopherson plays just an awful guy named Charlie Wade. He also only exists in the 60s. And the reason why Sam Deeds is even searching through his past and the past, like his past in particular and the past of this town and himself and his dad in general, is because he stumbles on a skeleton which appears to be a really horrible man named Charlie Wade, who disappeared mysteriously. Again, I keep doing the air quotes, but mysteriously, but it's not really that mysteriously. He disappeared decades earlier. People assumed he was dead, but nobody knew what exactly happened to Charlie Wade. And now he needs to figure out what happened to this awful guy, Charlie Wade. And I know my dad, meaning Buddy Deeds, had something to do with it. So that's really different. That's a kind of strange concept for a movie, that you have somebody in 1996 attempting to solve a crime and a mystery from 3 decades earlier involving his father, who was this legendary lawman. There's more going on than that. And oddly enough, a movie which celebrates its 21st anniversary today, believe it or not, is The Notebook. James Garner, Jenna Rollins, Ryan Gosling, Rachel McAdams. Now, I'm not randomly bringing that up. There is an angle in that story of young love being busted up by parents. In the world of The Notebook, it's just the mom of Rachel McAdams' character, Joan Allen, who does everything possible to keep her daughter away from the character of Noah, that's Ryan's character. And that is a straightforward version of the disapproving parent. He's a nice boy, but you can do better, and he's the kind of young man that I almost ended up with, and it would have been a terrible mistake, and that's what we get in The Notebook. Well, the reason why Sam Deeds, in the early going of this film, Lone Star, he seems to have issues with his father that are not conventional father-son problems. When he was younger, he was in love with a young woman named Pilar, played by wonderful actress who unfortunately has been gone for a decade. She died very young, Elizabeth Pena. If you don't know the name, she was in La Bamba with Lou Diamond Phillips and Esai Morales, of the last 2 Mission Impossibles. And she's fantastic in Bruce Joel Rubin's quite extraordinary screenplay and a movie adaptation by Adrian Lyne with Tim Robbins' Jacob's Ladder. So we meet Pilar as an adult, and she and Chris Cooper, Sam Deeds, they clearly have a history. We don't know exactly what, but it seems as if there was some kind of romance between them when they were kids. And that is exactly what it was. Pilar's mom came across the border illegally, right? I mean, you can't avoid it. That's what it was. And then she settled in and ended up doing quite well for herself. So Sam Deeds' problem is that when he was a kid, he and Pilar began to see one another and they fell in love. And Buddy Deeds put his foot down and put a stop to it. And stop me if you've heard that before, right? You have the father disapproving, and the expectation is a 60s Texas sheriff doesn't want his son hooking up with a girl who is here illegally. He wouldn't have said it that way, but he thinks the girl is beneath him. This is what we are presented with as the audience. This is what it seems to be. And we start to form a bit of a, we don't like McConaughey's character. Bro, let your son live his life. They're not hurting anybody. They're just kids. She's awesome. Her mom is great. But I am not going to spoil the reason why. Buddy Deeds does not, will not, under any circumstances, allow his son to fool around with this girl. It is not for reasons you think, and when you get to why, when you find out the why Buddy Deeds was involved in the first place, we're pretty sure he had something to do with the Charlie Wade death, but his involvement with the character of Pilar and the mom, when we realize the why, it shakes us. And this is a movie that leaves you shaken to the core, and you're not expecting it, and that is part of the reason why it is such a brilliant film. Because there are plot twists, but not in the way that you expect. There are plot twists based on character, and there are moments in the film that we think for sure are one way, and then later, when we look back, we say, holy shit, that is almost literally the opposite of why I thought this happened. Wow. So, this was a film that, if you just look at the box office numbers, it didn't do that well. It made somewhere between 12 and 15 million in the United States, but it only cost $3 million. And that's the thing, that is part of the magic of a filmmaker such as a John Sayles. He was able to make this movie very low budget, and it does not in any way look like a low budget film. It is gorgeously shot, and it is perfectly acted. And the more we learn when we get to those kinds of twists, we have to ask questions of ourselves. What would we do? What would we do in a situation that is completely impossible, intolerable? What would we do? So I remember when Lone Star came out, and the only John Sayles film I had seen as of the summer of 1996 was 8 Men Out. I hadn't seen Matewan yet. One of the more recent films he did was also starring Chris Cooper. I think it was called Silver City, where he plays a guy running for president who's a bit of a doofus. It was supposed to be a little bit of a thinly veiled reference to George W. Bush. But he did Cookie's Fortune also with Glenn Close, Chris O'Donnell, among others. Just a wonderful filmmaker. But when Lone Star landed, the critical reception from almost everyone was through the roof. Newsday's John Anderson, a critic I really respected, he gave it 4 stars. He thought it was Sayles' best film. And David Denby said, this is incredible. This goes down so many avenues we're not expecting. And Siskel and Ebert not only gave it 2 thumbs up, not only both gave it 4 stars, but they had it, both of them had it within their top 5 in a very crowded 1996 movie year. 96 is not the best year of the decade, but it is to me, a fantastic movie year. It's the year of The English Patient. It's the year of Fargo, and just some great movies that Independence Day, if you want to get silly with summer movies, but it's a terrific movie year. And I think Siskel had it 4th and Ebert had it 5th. I'm not 100% on that. But Lars von Trier's Breaking the Waves, many people felt was the best film of the year. Mike Leigh, Secrets and Lies, another huge movie from that year. Many people had that up there. Then there were people thought maybe Edward Zwick, Courage Under Fire, was going to get some awards consideration, maybe for Meg Ryan, maybe for Denzel, and that didn't happen. But 96, a good year. And I feel like Lone Star should have done better with the Academy, and you hate to be cynical and say that they nominated a bunch of independent films that year. Jerry Maguire, the joke was the only studio film nominated for Best Picture and many of the major awards. Tom Hanks should have won Best Actor. I'm sorry, I forgot about Shine, the film with Jeffrey Rush. He ended up winning Best Actor for what amounts to a supporting performance. He's not even in the movie until there's 30 minutes left. How does he win Best Actor? I don't know these things. But Lone Star is the kind of movie that I encourage people to seek out, even if you have to pay a couple of bucks. I think it's free on Tubi. I'm not sure on that, but I think that it's free somewhere on streaming, maybe on Canopy or one of the free apps. It's just an incredible film. And from the historical perspective, with Matthew McConaughey in particular, because you see his name, you expect that he's going to be in more of the movie than he is, but from a certain point of view, his character is actually the main character. He's the most important character. The most separate actions center around his character. Either he's taking them or people are trying to figure out what he did 30 years later and how he did it and why he did it. But it's a particular point in history where McConaughey was about to become a big star. Now, I saw him in theaters in a movie the previous year, more than a year earlier. There was a film in early 1995 called Boys on the Side. An interesting movie, not altogether successful. I liked it. I give it 3 stars out of 4, but it is an old school chick flick. It has the elements of Thelma and Louise, and the casting is crazy. If you've never heard of this film, you have Whoopi Goldberg, a very young Drew Barrymore who was still rising. She had had some personal problems, and Mary Louise Parker, who is awesome. She's great. She's almost like a cheat code. She's so good in everything she's ever been in. And it's a road movie. And the Drew Barrymore character marries like a shotgun wedding. And I don't even know why, but she marries a character played by Matthew McConaughey, who I didn't know who he was at the time, but I took note of him. He plays a character named Abraham Lincoln. Just the fact that they have a character in that movie named Abraham Lincoln, and not surprisingly, at one point in the movie, Matthew McConaughey is supposed to tell a fib on behalf of Drew Barrymore, and he goes, "I'm sorry, I cannot tell a lie." Absolute gold. But McConaughey was rising. And not long after John Sayles' Lone Star opened in limited release, here comes Joel Schumacher, a movie many consider to be his best film, A Time to Kill, with Matthew McConaughey and Sandra Bullock and Samuel L. Jackson. Just a fire Samuel L. Jackson, as always. So this movie was, during its kind of promotion and when people were talking about it, I remember a lot of discussion about this guy, Matthew McConaughey, is about to be a star. He is about to be Hollywood's next superstar. There's a lot of times where people get those things wrong, but in that instance, they got it right. And if all you know of McConaughey is, all right, and I mentioned a thing with Soderbergh, Matt Damon tells a story where he was on an audition once with Matthew McConaughey for a Steven Soderbergh film. I don't know if Matt was going to play one of the characters or one of the roles in Ocean's 11. I'm not sure what it was, but Matt Damon does this dead-on impersonation of, the 25 years ago Matthew McConaughey. He says he just kept asking Soderbergh if he could take his shirt off to film a scene. Mrs. Soderbergh, I think the scene works better if I take my shirt off. Can I take my shirt off? And Matt Damon does the Matthew McConaughey impression a lot better than I do. And the Letterman audience was cracking up. But McConaughey was on the rise, and he gives a really just an amazing performance. Like, he could have gotten a Best Supporting Actor nomination. That's how good. And the layering of John Sayles' screenplay, it adds depth and texture. It makes McConaughey's performance seem even better in reflection. Why is he so angry? Why is he taking these actions with his son? And then we have these almost facepalm moments, one after another, where we say, I get why he did it. I understand. It had to have hurt him to do this and to take these actions, which seemed to be against his own son. What was he supposed to do? Amazing. So, Lone Star, 29 years ago this week, It was released in limited in the United States to widespread critical acclaim. It's well into the 90s on Rotten Tomatoes. I believe it is John Sayles' best film. And it is the newest entry in our continuing series of both the great movies and the best movie you've never seen. Lone Star, written and directed by the fantastic John Sayles and starring Matthew McConaughey, Chris Cooper, Clifton James, Elizabeth Pena, and Joe Morton in a supporting role. That's Miles Dyson from Terminator 2. In a supporting role, Joe Morton. This has been episode 573 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your hopefully happy hump day here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.